There's an idea we repeat almost without thinking that Michael Jordan never got it wrong, that he could miss a shot, lose a game, even a series, but that, deep down, he always ended up being right. That certainty became part of the myth. Something so ingrained it stopped being questioned, as if challenging it were almost a sign of disrespect to history. The problem appears when that margin disappears completely, when there's no clock running, no crowd pushing, no ball that allows everything to be fixed on the next possession, when the decision isn't executed with the body but with power. That's where the mistake doesn't get erased, it stays. And there was one moment, just one, when Jordan didn't lose a game. He lost something more delicate, something that can't be measured in statistics or relived in highlights. We're talking about the worst mistake of his career, and the worst part is that it had nothing to do with playing basketball. Do you want to know the truth about Michael? Then get ready, because what I'm about to tell you is 100% juicy data. On January 13, 1999, Michael Jordan announced his retirement for the second time. He was 35 years old, had just won his 6th ring with Chicago, and had closed out a perfect season in symbolic terms. Last shot, last title, last gesture of dominance. From the outside, it looked like a cosmic, perfectly rounded ending, but from the inside, not so much. Because Jordan didn't retire defeated or surpassed. He retired empty of rivals. The lockout had paralyzed the league, the Bulls were being dismantled, and the context no longer offered the kind of challenge that had kept him awake for more than a decade. There was no clear mountain left to climb, and for someone built around constant competition, that was a serious problem. During that year away from the court, Jordan didn't disappear. He kept training, kept giving his opinions, kept orbiting the game, not from the center of the stage, but close enough not to let go of it completely. Basketball was no longer something he did. It was something he needed to control, and that's where a silent shift begins. For the first time since he was a teenager, Jordan couldn't impose his will with his body. He couldn't solve things with a fadeaway or punish a defensive weakness. The competition was still there, but the playing field had changed. It was no longer about beating another player, but about influencing a system, about deciding, about commanding. When Michael Jordan arrived in Washington, the context couldn't have been more fragile. The Washington Wizards were coming off years of irrelevance with a 12-38 record in the 1999-2000 season and a completely within the league. Jordan was officially introduced in January 2000 as president of basketball operations. He didn't arrive as a decorative figure, he arrived with real power, control over basketball decisions, direct influence over roster construction, and an implicit promise. If anyone could straighten this out, it was him. The problem was that the franchise wasn't designed to be straightened out quickly. Washington had heavy contracts, veteran players who weren't performing at the expected level, and virtually no salary cap flexibility. The most visible name was Juwan Howard on a max contract that didn't match the impact the team needed. He wasn't a bad player, but he symbolized the problem. A lot of money, little flexibility, and no clear short-term way out. From the very first moment, Jordan wanted to mark his territory. He made quick decisions, some without internal consensus, and began projecting public goals that didn't align with the reality of the roster. He promised immediate improvements, talked about competitiveness, and made it clear he wasn't there for a long process. The message was clear: there would be no patience. The detail is that Jordan wasn't in Washington every day. Much of the management was done remotely from Chicago with phone calls and brief visits. For an organization that needed constant presence, internal order, and cultural rebuilding, that distance started to cost a lot. Not because of a lack of authority, but because of too much confidence that his figure alone was enough to hold everything together. That's where the central tension of this stage takes shape. There was no bad intention, nor total improvisation. There was something more dangerous, the certainty that the method that had always worked would work this time too. By the year 2000, the problem was no longer just Washington. Michael was still untouchable as a player, but his name was beginning to carry an uncomfortable truth. He's a great competitor, but as an executive, he's questionable. That was a perception starting to take shape, slowly but persistently. The first months at the helm of the Washington Wizards didn't help. The team didn't improve, the decisions didn't produce immediate results, and the mistakes were amplified because they carried his signature. Every move was read as an extension of his character. It was no longer just about whether the franchise was failing, but whether Jordan was failing in a role that didn't naturally belong to him. The press was key in that shift in atmosphere. Columnists who had protected his image for years began to distance themselves. The narrative started to organize itself in a dangerous way. The player had been an unrepeatable genius, but his work as an executive seemed to be driven by impulses, pride, and excessive confidence in his own judgment. And that's where the real pressure appears, the kind you don't see. Jordan wasn't just trying to improve a team, he was, consciously or not, defending an image. because accepting that he could seriously be wrong implied something deeper, acknowledging that his competitive advantage wasn't universal, that not everything could be solved with the same logic. That context turns every future decision into something heavier than it should be. It's no longer just about choosing well, but about proving that you can choose well, about validating authority, about shutting mouths, and when decisions start to carry that silent objective, they stop being purely basketball decisions. The 2001 NBA draft offered no certainties. There was no name to define the night, no obvious talent around whom a future could be built without doubts. For a franchise in deep reconstruction, that kind of draft is usually a problem. For someone under pressure, it can become a deadly trap. The class was strange even by the standards of the time. There were 4 players coming straight out of high school, a European prospect with upside but no clear NBA precedent, an 18-year-old freshman, and only 1 player with 4 complete college seasons. None fit the sure thing category. They all brought big questions and very few answers. In that context, Washington held the first pick, a privilege in theory, a burden in practice. Picking first didn't mean picking best, but picking without a safety net. Every alternative implied a different risk, betting on long-term development, trusting physical tools over a finished game, or settling for a more limited but known profile. There was no move that guaranteed immediate success. The atmosphere around the draft didn't help either. Analysts were divided, mock drafts changed week to week, and comparisons leaned more toward desire than evidence. People talked about potential, ceilings, bodies ready to dominate, but almost never about context, about patience, about time, elements Washington didn't have in abundance. So the draft stopped being a technical instance and became a test of character. There was no consensus to support the final decision, no manual pointing to the right path, just a hot seat, a ticking clock, and the urgent need to get it right on a night when almost no one really knew what getting it right meant. Within that board full of doubts, Kwame Brown began to stand out for a very simple reason. He fit what Washington believed it needed. Not for what he was at that moment, but for what he promised to be. He was 18 years old, nearly 6 feet 11 inches, moved with uncommon agility for his size, and showed a level of physical strength that, for many scouts, couldn't be taught. It came from home. His personal story was also striking from day one. Brown came from a difficult family background, changed his decision at the last moment. He had initially committed to the University of Florida and ultimately declared for the draft pushed by an urgent economic reality. That, far from being seen as a weakness, was read as maturity, as someone who had grown up fast, who understood what was at stake, and who wouldn't waste a golden opportunity. In scouting reports, the strengths were clear: lateral quickness, power, big hands, athletic ability to defend multiple positions. In a league that still deeply valued the big man, Brown appeared as an ideal blank canvas. He wasn't finished, but that was part of the appeal. The reasoning was straightforward. Raw talent can't be taught. Everything else can be learned. Even in private workouts, Brown left good impressions. He showed competitiveness, personality, and a confidence that was surprising for his age. In the famous pre-draft one-on-one, he dominated another top candidate, Tyson Chandler, and sealed an impression that had already been growing. It wasn't just about physical tools, it was attitude, confidence, presence. The point is that all of this existed on a theoretical plane. On paper, Brown was the perfect project, young, moldable, with the tools to become a dominant center. What didn't appear as clearly were his technical shortcomings, his need for real development time, and above all, the type of environment required to keep that potential from becoming a burden. But on that night, that took a back seat, because when a player seems to have everything that can't be manufactured, it's easy to convince yourself that the rest will arrive on its own. And from there, the project stopped being a future bet and turned into something much heavier, a decision that had to work. The problem didn't start on draft night, it started afterward, when Kwame Brown stopped being a project and became an answer. Washington didn't need him as a long-term learning process, it needed him as an immediate sign that everything was under control. And that, for an 18-year-old kid, is a burden that rarely ends well. The environment Brown landed in was anything but developmental. The Washington Wizards didn't have a structure designed to develop young talent, nor a stable locker room, nor a patient narrative. Every mistake was magnified, every doubt turned into noise. And in that climate, tolerance for the process was practically non-existent. On top of that came a dominant figure who took up all the space. Michael Jordan returned to the court in 2001, and with his comeback, the team's axis completely shifted. The spotlight moved, urgencies accelerated, and the margin for learning suddenly shrank. Jordan didn't coexist well with waiting. He never had. His logic was simple: compete now, perform now, respond now. For a veteran, that demand can be fuel. For a rookie just starting out, it's usually poison. Brown went from needing controlled minutes and accepted mistakes to being evaluated as if he already had answers. There was no bridge between what he was and what he was expected to be, just a leap into the void. The mistake then wasn't betting on talent, it was placing that talent in a context that didn't know how to protect it. There was no clear development plan, no shield to absorb the pressure, no figure who understood that growth also involves failing without immediate consequences. The environment didn't support the player it had chosen. And when a young project breaks so early, it's rarely only because of what the player couldn't do. Many times it's because of everything the context demanded of him too soon. As the years went by, the decision began to take on another dimension, not because of what Kwame Brown failed to become, but because of what happened around him. With each passing season, the 2001 draft turned into an uncomfortable mirror. While Brown tried to stay afloat, other names from that same class began to build solid careers. Paul Gasol became a central piece on contending teams and ended up lifting titles. Tyson Chandler found his place, became a defensive anchor, and eventually was recognized as the best at his role. Shane Battier built a career as a key player on championship teams. Without noise, without grand promises, but with real impact. Even Eddie Curry, with his pros and cons, ended up being part of a championship team. None of that happened immediately. It wasn't a simultaneous avalanche, it was crueler than that. A constant drip. Year after year, someone from the same draft found his place while Brown carried a label that grew heavier and heavier. It didn't matter that he stayed in the league, that he added seasons, that he reinvented himself as a role player. For many, the verdict had already been written. That contrast finished cementing the narrative. The story came to be told as a simple equation of hits and misses. The number one pick versus everything that could have been. A comfortable reading, but an incomplete one. Because in that aftermath, it wasn't only a player who was judged. The decision that had put him there also began to be quietly re-examined. And when a choice starts to haunt you more for what others achieved than for what you tried to build, there's not much room left to rewrite it. The impact of that decision didn't end with Kwame Brown's career. Over time, it became something very different from what was expected of a number one draft pick. In 2005, he was traded to the Los Angeles Lakers, and by then it was already clear that the label of future superstar was not going to be fulfilled. Even so, he managed to stay in the league for more than a decade, occupying a much more down-to-earth role. Physicality, interior presence, unglamorous work near the rim, and little else. It wasn't the career that was projected when he was selected first overall, but it wasn't the career of someone who disappeared at the first blow either. Brown found a place, traveled around the NBA for years, and along the way, signed contracts that allowed him to surpass $63 million in salaries, a figure that speaks more to survival within the system than to glory. For Michael Jordan, the cost was silent but deep, not immediate, not scandalous, but persistent. Every reference to his time as an executive inevitably returned to the same point. The nuances didn't matter, nor the context, nor the team's conditions. The narrative was simplified until it was reduced to an idea that was hard to reverse. The greatest player in history didn't know how to build things from a desk. That perception began to contaminate everything else. Previous decisions in Washington were reinterpreted under the same lens. Mistakes seemed bigger, successes smaller. Even moves that made sense at the time were overshadowed by a single choice that had gone wrong and that no one was willing to forget. The relationship with the Washington Wizards eventually deteriorated. When Jordan stopped playing for good in 2003, the organization decided to sever ties on the executive side as well. It wasn't an elegant or symbolic exit. It was a rough, devastating ending that made it clear his figure no longer generated order, but division. From there, something broke. For the first time, Jordan didn't control the narrative. There were no titles to correct it, no heroic performances to cover it up. His legacy as a player remained intact, but his image as a complete leader had been marked, and that, for someone who always needed to dominate every space he occupied, was a harder blow than it seemed. The most ironic part is that the mistake wasn't the result of disinterest or improvisation. It was, to a large extent, a consequence of the very trait that had made him unstoppable for years. The absolute conviction that his way of seeing the game was the right one. On the court, that certainty built a legend, an icon of the sport, but outside of it, it came at a price. For years, we got used to thinking of Michael Jordan as a figure without cracks. The perfect guy who always chose right, who understood the game better than anyone, and who, when he made a mistake, found a way to turn that error into fuel. That image is still real, but incomplete. Because this story isn't about a bad pick or a player who didn't meet expectations, it's about a limit, about the moment when the competitive instinct that made him invincible stopped being an automatic advantage, about when urgency pressure and the need to prove something ended up playing against him. Jordan didn't fail due to a lack of knowledge or disinterest. He failed because he tried to apply the logic of the total player to a space that demanded something else. Patience, structure, protection, virtues he never needed to develop when he could solve everything with a ball in his hands. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all, that the worst mistake of his career wasn't a single bad decision, but discovering too late that even the greatest of all time had a territory where his greatness wasn't enough. The question that remains floating is the following: what happens when a myth is faced with a game he can no longer dominate like before? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. This was Hoop Secrets, and I'll see you next time.